Hey, welcome to Wisdom Wednesday with Pastor Josh. Wisdom is the quality or state of being wise, as knowledge of what is true, right, coupled with just judgment as to action, sagacity, discernment, and insight. We're going to look at what that means today on this edition of Wisdom Wednesday. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me again today for our podcast as we go through the book Unoffendable by Brant Hansen. And we're in chapter 11 today, where he entitles it Atheist, Socialist, and Toast. And he opens up with a story that he heard from Lecrae in a news article at one point, where it talks about refusing to be alienated and put off by the sin of others is what allows me to be Christ-like. The article read, quoting Lecrae, that Christians have no idea how to deal with art, Lecrae said. More recently, during a September speech to Christian leaders, they say, hey, Lecrae, you can't do that. That's bad. That's secular. You can't touch that. Hey, Lecrae, your engineer is not a Christian. He can't mix your stuff. He's going to get sinner cooties on it. So because Lecrae is a rapper, if you're not familiar with him, who is a believer. And it says, this is real. I wish I was making this up, he said. And then Brant says, yeah, me too. I wish he were making that up. The writer of the article went on to explain this mindset to a mainstream readership, and I think he nailed it. Evangelicals adopted an isolationist mindset for much of the 20th century. Non-Christians, the thinking went, carried sin like a virus, and the point of following Jesus was to remain as pure as possible. Christians established their own communities, educational institutions, and music festivals, separate from the rest of the world. And it's interesting because they go on. He goes on to talk about this a little bit more and quotes Mike Connolly, who says, Christians do not condone unbiblical living, we redeem it. And he's referencing the book by Connolly called Messy Spirituality. This is a hard topic. What does this have to do with being offended? For most Christians, a lot of the offense comes from the world not being as holy as we think it should be. We see that in relationships, right? We see that when somebody responds unchristian. Well, the truth is that if they don't know Christ, how can they respond like Christ? We can't hold the world to that standard unless they've heard about Christ and allowed Him to actually begin a work in them. It's so easy. Christians, we do this all the time, is that we treat and we get mad at doctors and hospitals and whatever that do this, right? How would you like to go to a doctor's appointment for something that's bothering you? And he says, well, these are your symptoms, so I have some stuff that'll help with your symptoms. But he has no desire to figure out what's really going on. I've actually, sadly, been in some of those doctor's appointments where at the end of it, you're like, hey, don't you want to know kind of what's going on? Like, don't we want to figure out what's going on? But they seem content to handle your symptoms. You can never fix a disease or a sickness like that by handling the symptoms. You have to attack the disease. You have to attack the virus to actually take care of the symptoms. And so we do that all the time as Christians. We try to attack the world's behavior. And Christianity isn't about behavior modification. It's really about a life-transforming power that meets us, right? It's about the grace of Christ that begins to transform us. It's amazing grace that that saved a wretch like me. And it's this power to change lives. I say all the time that Jesus didn't come to make bad people good. He came to bring dead people back to life. And that's so important. How can a dead person change, right? That doesn't happen. We need to have life back in us. And so Brant is really referencing a lot of that in this chapter, where he says, refusing to be angry about others' views isn't conflict avoidance or happy talk. It's the very nature of serving people. And then he goes on to say, he says, I'm not responsible for changing people's lives. I'm responsible for faithfully loving them. He says, as a believer, that means pointing them to a God who dearly wants them and for whom I happen to know they yearn. And then at the end of the chapter here, the very last statement, he says, don't condemn the culture, redeem it. And that's really the heart of God. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we've been given this ministry of reconciliation, this act of putting two things back together and mending them back together. And so we have the power to do that. We have this message that mends and it restores, and that's what we're really called to do. But the problem is that we're so bent on fixing things that when we can't fix it, offense arises. And we can't allow that to happen. We can't allow the offense to arise in us because we're trying to fix everything and no one else wants to adhere to what we think should be done. Trusting God. We keep hearing that every chapter. Trusting God to change people. Leaving that up to Him. A lot of the stress that we carry around every day because of offense has a lot to do with us being upset that people aren't, changing to our expectations. It has a lot to do with what we feel like should be happening that doesn't happen. Really, it can even speak to control. It can speak to wanting to control others and make it happen, right? To manipulate or to bring it about in our own power. And none of that stuff we're called to. And that's what's so hard, is that we have to lay down our chisels so that God can pick it up. And so if we're too busy trying to chisel away at someone, the problem is that many times we don't know what is underneath the stone, and we don't know what God is intending to do with that person. And so we try to chisel away at what we think needs to be taken care of right now. And before we realize it, we're cracking the structure. We're cracking the statue in places that it shouldn't be cracked. And it makes it harder for that person to become all that God has called them to be, because we're too busy chiseling away at them. And that's what Paul is really referencing when he says, stop biting and devouring one another, right? Don't give ourselves over to that. So I just want to encourage you, put the chisel down. Put the chisel down, let God do the work, trust Him with it. And I think we're going to have a lot less stress in our lives. We're going to have a lot more of a stress-free living, of being able to live in the joy of the Lord and be able to see our relationships a little differently. So I encourage you, put the chisel down, let God pick it up. And thanks for joining me today. Join me tomorrow for chapter 12 of the book, and which is about our halfway point through the book. And so thanks for joining me today. See you tomorrow.